Is Jesus just a Zalmoxis copycat? Hi, I'm Nathan, and welcome to another video for Connect Apologetics. My passion is to write, and sometimes make these videos, about the evidence that points to Christianity being true. Sometimes in demonstrating that Christianity is true, we have to first spend a bit of time showing that it's not false, and that's where our focus will be in this video. One of the common claims that people sometimes make about Jesus is that the Gospels, which tell us about his life and ministry, have been coloured or impacted by prior mythology. People who make these claims sometimes believe that Jesus himself is a mythological figure who didn't exist, or more commonly, that a man named Jesus did exist, but that the stories we have about him in the New Testament are mostly myths or legends. They also suggest that the idea of dying and rising gods was a common theme in prior mythologies, and that the resurrection of Jesus belongs to this category of dying and rising god myths. For this claim to have any impact on what Christians believe about Jesus, atheists and critics would need to show that there were pre-existing mythologies that Christianity actively borrowed from, and that the beliefs of the early church and the New Testament authors were based on these stories and not on the life of Jesus of Nazareth. One of the names sometimes suggested as a possible precursor to Jesus is Zalmoxis, who was worshipped by the Thracians 400 years before Christianity began. We know about Zalmoxis primarily because his story is recorded for us by the Greek historian Herodotus in his work Histories, although there are also some references to Zalmoxis by Plato, Strabo, Porphyry, and Jordanes. Richard Carrier, an atheist activist and history scholar, is particularly fond of pointing to similarities between Zalmoxis and Jesus, highlighting the fact that the story of Zalmoxis involves death and resurrection, believers going to heaven, and a sacred meal shared in his honour. Now, if Christianity is true, it has to be able to withstand the best arguments against it, and Richard Carrier is a pretty notorious critic, so I'll be interacting primarily with Richard's ideas about Zalmoxis. Let's start with a 2006 article available on the infidels.org website, which I've included the link for at the bottom of the screen. You can also find it in the video description down below. I want to start by highlighting some of Carrier's words here so we can get a clear sense of the case he is making. Talking about parallel Jesus stories, Carrier writes, "Then there is Herodotus, who was always a popular author and had been for centuries. He told of a Thracian religion that began with the physical resurrection of a man called Zalmoxis, who then started a cult in which it was taught that believers went to heaven when they died. So according to this description, the Zalmoxis story starts with his physical resurrection, and this event spawns a cult whose followers believe they will go to heaven. At this point, it does sound a lot like the Christian resurrection narrative. Jesus was physically resurrected from the dead, and his number of followers suddenly ballooned, and they believed that they would have eternal life." Let's look at another quote from Carrier on Zalmoxis, this time one I transcribed from a YouTube video of one of his lectures. Once again, I've put the link on screen for you, and it's also down in the video description. The topic is the category of dying and rising gods, and Carrier is comparing different figures or stories to the resurrection of Jesus. Zalmoxis is another one. He's a Thracian, Bulgarian, Celtic, we're not sure, dying and rising god, and his, when you share sacred meals in his honour, you get to be saved in the afterlife. Does that sound familiar? If you share in the sacred meals of Zalmoxis, then you get to be saved. The meal seems to be the gateway to salvation. Perhaps Richard is trying to draw the parallel here between communion or the Lord's Supper in Christianity and the meal that was part of the Zalmoxis cult. Again, he repeats some similarities to the Jesus account. There was a death, but then the dead person rose back to life, and also that there was some kind of salvation on offer for the afterlife. So let's just sketch out the important points from both quotes in the one place. Carrier says, "This religion starts with the physical resurrection of Zalmoxis, who then started a cult that taught that believers went to heaven when they died, and if you share in his sacred meal, you get to be saved in the afterlife." Point number 5 I've added in. It isn't a quote, but it's the reason Carrier is sharing the details about Zalmoxis with us. He's making the point that the details are extremely similar to the resurrection story of Jesus or the beliefs of Christianity. If Richard Carrier is right on these points, then Zalmoxis could well be a historical precursor for the resurrected Jesus. But we need to do the heavy lifting ourselves. We need to read Herodotus. Is there evidence in Herodotus to support these 5 claims? Let's have a look at the primary source document, which is History, Book 4, Section 95. Herodotus writes, "For myself, I've been told by the Greeks who dwell beside the Hellespont and Pontus that this Zalmoxis was a man who was once a slave in Samos, his master being Pythagoras, son of Nicarchus. Presently, after being freed and gaining great wealth, he returned to his own country." It seems that Zalmoxis was a Thracian slave who served Pythagoras, the great philosopher and mathematician. In some of the other source documents, Porphyry tells us that Pythagoras loved Zalmoxis and instructed him in sublime speculations concerning sacred rites and the nature of the gods, while Jordanes explains that in the countries of Dacia, Thrace and Moesia, Zalmoxis reigned, whom many writers of annals mention as a man of remarkable learning in philosophy. If we accept all of these accounts as being factual, then the picture we get is of a slave who serves his master well. He learns a lot of the Greek wisdom of the era, both philosophical and spiritual. He makes his fortune and then heads home to his own country. Let's read on in Herodotus. "Now the Thracians were a meanly living and simple-witted folk, but this Zalmoxis knew Ionian usages and a fuller way of life than the Thracian, for he had consorted with Greeks, and moreover with one of the greatest Greek teachers, Pythagoras. Wherefore he made himself a hall, where he entertained and feasted the chief among his countrymen, and taught them that neither he nor his guests, nor any of their descendants should ever die, but that they should go to a place where they would live forever and have all good things." According to Herodotus, the Thracians were simple, while Zalmoxis had learned Greek customs and beliefs. He was also wealthy, so he built himself a hall and was wining and dining the local power brokers, obviously getting chummy with them and earning their favour. This idea is also supported by Strabo, one of the other historical sources on Zalmoxis, who tells us that the Thracian king came to rely on Zalmoxis for his wisdom and his astrological knowledge. Let's read the final paragraph of Herodotus and then begin to draw some conclusions on the parallels between Zalmoxis and Jesus. "While he was doing as I have said, and teaching this doctrine, he was all the while making him an underground chamber. When this was finished, he vanished from the sight of the Thracians, and descended into the underground chamber, where he lived for 3 years, the Thracians wishing him back and mourning him for dead. Then in the 4th year he appeared to the Thracians, and thus they came to believe what Zalmoxis had told them. Such is the Greek story about him." What conclusions can we draw from Herodotus about parallels between Jesus and Zalmoxis? Let's compare what we've read in the account to the 5 points we drew from Richard Carrier's description of them. Firstly, we need to notice that the teaching about eternal life comes before any resurrection claim. Zalmoxis feasts with local nobles and tells them that they will live forever in a good place. So, contrary to what Richard Carrier says, this religion actually starts with Zalmoxis teaching his friends about eternal life. But more importantly, Carrier's whole case hangs on the idea that in the story, Zalmoxis died and was physically resurrected, or at the very least, that the Thracians believed that he was. Nobody dies in the text, so from the evidence we have, this can't be a resurrection story, because a resurrection requires a dead person to start with. Zalmoxis just hides underground for a few years. The Thracians initially thought that he had died, which is strange, because unlike the disciples of Jesus, these guys hadn't seen a dead body. Anyhow, for some reason they leapt to the conclusion he was dead. But when Zalmoxis finally appeared to them above ground, Herodotus tells us that the Thracians believed what Zalmoxis had told them, which was that they would never die, but instead live forever in paradise. This almost certainly disconfirms their prior belief that he had been dead, and now the only thing left for them to believe is that instead of dying, Zalmoxis had gone to the good place and had then returned to them from there. The teaching that gets established among the Thracians about eternal life is simply nothing like the death and physical resurrection that we hear about in the Gospels. Does the Zalmoxis religion start with a physical resurrection? It doesn't seem that way to me. Actually, it seems to start with Zalmoxis coming back up from his basement and giving some simple folk the impression that his teaching about living forever was true. There's nothing even like a resurrection in the Zalmoxis account in Herodotus. So let's move on to Carrier's second point. Out of Zalmoxis' disappearing act, a cult is established. It seems like Zalmoxis was intentionally deceiving the poor Thracians to get a following, and that ended up spawning a religion. I've got no issue with point number 2. He definitely started a religion or a cult of some kind. Point number 3, Carrier says that the Zalmoxis cult taught that the believers would go to heaven when they died. Firstly, as we've just discussed, the word believe is only used to tell us that the Thracians believed what Zalmoxis had told them about living forever. There's also nothing in Herodotus to suggest that belief was some kind of condition of entry to the afterlife. When Carrier says that believers were the ones who could go to the afterlife, he's importing something to the text that really isn't there. Another problem is that Carrier says that believers would go to heaven when they die, but the word heaven isn't written anywhere in the passage from Herodotus. The text just says that they would go to an unspecified place and have good things, and this is majorly different to the Christian idea of heaven. For a start, perhaps the most fundamental property of heaven is that it's where God is. Christians believe that when we die, we go to be with the Lord, for a time, as an unembodied soul. His presence is the whole point. Heaven is not some unspecified place of general good. It's where the source of maximal goodness in our life and our identity and our very being comes from, because God himself is there. If God isn't there, it can't be heaven. The place that Herodotus describes is a completely different concept to heaven. In addition to that, the New Testament teaches that Christians don't end up in heaven anyway, but rather that after a temporary unembodied state, we'll be resurrected into new imperishable bodies and live with Jesus in a newly created physical world. Heaven is not at all the end game for the Christian. Zalmoxis didn't teach his followers they would go to heaven, because there's no mention of heaven and there's no mention of God who is in heaven. The only way I can interpret Carrier's usage of the term heaven is that he's deliberately trying to pass these two different ideas off as if they're the same thing. But clearly, they're not. What do we get from Herodotus about the teachings of Zalmoxis? We're told that Zalmoxis taught that he and his guests would never die. Instead, they would go to another place and have all good things. Nothing about believing, nothing about heaven, just dinner and paradise. Number 4, if you share the sacred meal, you get to be saved in the afterlife. Now, unlike the idea that believers could go to the afterlife, this point at least has some basis in the text. Zalmoxis taught that his guests wouldn't die, and I'll grant from this that we could say that maybe some part of being a guest at one of his feasts, possibly eating the meal, is the conditional requirement for entry into his afterlife. The second part, however, is yet another example of Carrier borrowing Christian language to paint similarities where they don't really exist. He says that if you ate the meal, you were saved in the afterlife. Saved from what? Herodotus doesn't help us. He doesn't talk about anyone being saved. We can only assume that Carrier means to be saved from death, seeing as Zalmoxis teaches his guests that they won't die. This idea, that Zalmoxis is saving his friends from death, is not stated directly anywhere in the text. Maybe you could imply it, but really, this is another example of projecting Christian terminology onto the Zalmoxis account to make him seem a little bit more similar to Jesus. But it actually falls short of being a good parallel of Christian beliefs, because death is only part of what Jesus saves us from. Death is brought about by the fact that we're all guilty of sinning against God and against other people. Death is just the consequence of sin, which is the thing we're actually saved from. When Jesus died on the cross, he died to take the punishment for my wrongdoing. He got what I deserved, and he chose to bear my punishment for me out of love. He saved me from my sin. There's no aspect of the Zalmoxis story that's concerned with sin or our moral accountability before God. So the claim that it somehow parallels the Christian idea of being saved is really flimsy. Anyway, Carrier claims that in the Thracian cult, if you share in the sacred meal in the hall of Zalmoxis, you get to be saved in the afterlife. But seeing as there's nothing about being saved in any part of the account, we should probably just take it to mean that you get to be in the other life that Zalmoxis had promised his buddies. Which leads us to point 5. The whole point of trying to establish Zalmoxis as being similar to Jesus in some aspects of his story is to set up a scenario where you can accuse the gospel writers of borrowing ideas from Herodotus, or as part of a cumulative case, to show that the category of dying and rising gods is something that exists prior to the Gospels, and that Jesus falls neatly into that box, and so we can write him off as a mythological irrelevance to our lives. But if we put Carrier's depiction of Zalmoxis side by side with what we actually see in Herodotus, it's clear that the stories are not as similar as he makes out, and that Zalmoxis is actually not an example of a dying and rising God anyway. Let's recap. According to Richard Carrier, the Thracian religion starts with the physical resurrection of Zalmoxis, who then started a cult that taught that believers went to heaven when they died, and if you share in his sacred meal, you get to be saved in the afterlife. But according to Herodotus, this religion starts with the return from the underground chamber of Zalmoxis, who then started a cult that taught that his dinner guests went to a good place instead of dying, and if you shared in his sacred meal, you would get to be in the other life. At the start of the video, I asked, is Jesus just a Zalmoxis copycat? Are the Gospels just mythology based on prior mythologies like Zalmoxis? Are there many similarities at all between the Lord of the Christian faith and the wise Thracian philosopher who became revered as a god? Well, if we take away Zalmoxis' death and his resurrection, then we can't really claim he was a dying and rising god. And if we factor in that there is no mention in the source text at all about heaven, then the only similarity left standing is that both Zalmoxis and Jesus had some kind of special meal held in their honor, pretty much like any other god figure of ancient times. The only mythology Christians should be concerned about is the kind that claims that Zalmoxis and Jesus have any remarkable similarity at all. When we look at the evidence, we find that nearly all of the claims about Zalmoxis are either wildly exaggerated or just completely false. Again, my name's Nathan. Thanks for watching this video, and please keep coming back to my website, which is www.connectapologetics.blogspot.com for more articles and hopefully in the future more of these videos. In the meantime, you can follow me on Twitter, where my handle is @connectapx, and you can also like this video and subscribe to my channel if you want to see more videos from me. I'll see you next time, and until then, please enjoy these big guitars.